There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a piano when no one is playing it. Not the silence of an empty room or an unoccupied chair. Those silences are passive, waiting, unremarkable. The silence inside a closed piano is active. It holds the memory of every note that has ever been struck on its strings, every chord that has resonated through its body, every piece of music that has passed through the hands of every person who has ever sat at its bench and pressed the keys and created, from wood and wire and felt and the physics of vibrating air, the closest thing to magic that the physical world permits. The Bosendorfer Imperial Grand Piano in the Central Train Station's Grand Hall had been silent for 11 months when Lena Volkov sat down at its bench on a Tuesday night in February and played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor from memory, in the dark, with the technique of someone who had trained at a conservatory and the emotion of someone who had lost everything except the music and was holding on to it with both hands. She had not intended to play. She had intended to sleep. The train station was where she slept, not officially, not with permission, but with the quiet tolerance of the night security staff who had grown accustomed to the slender woman with the auburn hair and the canvas bag who curled up on the bench near the east wall, and who never caused trouble, and who was gone by 6 every morning before the commuter rush. She had been sleeping in the station for 3 weeks, since the Refugee Processing Center on Via Garibaldi had closed its overflow beds, and the women's shelter on Corso Napoli had a 6-week waiting list, and the alternatives. The doorways, the park benches, the underpass near the docks were not alternatives for a woman alone in a city she had arrived in 4 months ago, with a suitcase, a conservatory diploma, and the particular displacement of someone who had left a country that was no longer safe and arrived in a country that was not yet home. She had noticed the piano on her first night in the station. It was impossible not to notice. It sat on its low marble platform like a monument, the brass plaque catching the emergency lighting, the curved body gleaming black in the amber half-dark. She had read the plaque for Katerina, who believed music belonged to everyone. She had looked at the piano the way a starving person looks at food behind glass, with hunger and recognition and the painful awareness that the thing she needed most was right there, within reach, and she could not bring herself to touch it because touching it would remind her of everything the music had been before the world broke and everything it could no longer be. She had been a pianist, not a hobby pianist, not a casual player, but a serious, rigorously trained, competition-entering, conservatory-graduating pianist who had spent 22 of her 28 years at a keyboard and whose identity was so thoroughly constructed around the act of making music that removing the piano from her life was like removing a language from her mouth. The thoughts were still there. The structures were still there. The muscle memory lived in her fingers like a ghost, but the instrument through which those thoughts became sound was gone. She had trained at the Lysenko Conservatory in Kiev. Her mother, Anahit, Armenian, a pianist herself, a woman who had married a Ukrainian engineer and settled in Kiev and who had placed Lena's hands on a piano at the age of 6 with the words, "This is how we talk to God when words are not enough," had been her first teacher. Anahit had recognized the talent immediately. Not just facility. Many children have facility. The quick fingers and the sharp ear that make the early grades of piano study look effortless. What Anahit recognized in her daughter was something rarer, the emotional intelligence that separates a technician from a musician, the ability to understand that a note is not just a sound but a word, and that a phrase is not just a sequence but a sentence, and that a piece of music is not just a composition but a conversation between the composer and the performer and the listener, conducted across centuries and languages and the particular silence that lives inside a piano waiting to be broken. Lena had excelled. Competitions, recitals, a scholarship to the conservatory, a degree in piano performance with a specialization in Romantic-era repertoire. Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, the composers who understood that the piano is not a percussion instrument, but a voice. capable of singing and whispering and weeping and shouting and doing all of these things simultaneously if the hands that play it understand what the music is trying to say. The war had ended everything, not immediately. The first months had been displacement without destruction, the move from Kiev to Lviv, the temporary apartment, the borrowed upright piano in a neighbor's living room, where Lena practiced 4 hours a day because practicing was the only thing that made the world make sense. But then Lviv had become dangerous too, and the journey west had begun. Poland, then Austria, then south through Slovenia, and finally Italy, where the refugee processing system had absorbed her into its machinery and deposited her in this coastal city with a temporary residence permit and a place on a waiting list for housing assistance, and no piano, no income, no professional contacts, and the daily humiliation of a woman who had been trained to create beauty, finding herself unable to afford food. Her mother had stayed in Lviv. Anahit Volkov, 61 years old, arthritic hands that could no longer play the Chopin she had taught her daughter, had refused to leave. "I will not die in a country that is not mine," she had told Lena at the train station, pressing the gold treble clef pendant into her daughter's palm. "You go. You play. You carry the music where it needs to go. I will be fine. I am Armenian and Ukrainian, and I have survived worse than this. And if I haven't survived worse than this, I will survive this, and that will be enough." Lena had left. She had carried the pendant and the photograph and the sheet music and the muscle memory and the grief across 4 borders and deposited all of it in a train station in a city she did not know, where a Bosendorfer Imperial grand piano sat on a marble platform with a plaque that said, "Music belonged to everyone." And for 3 weeks she had looked at it and not touched it because she was afraid that if she started playing, she would not be able to stop. And if she could not stop, she would cry. And if she cried, she would break. And if she broke, she would not be able to put herself back together, because the glue that held her together was discipline, and the discipline required not playing, not feeling, not remembering that she was a musician in a world that had no room for her music. On the Tuesday night in February, she broke, not dramatically. There was no crisis, no precipitating event, no moment of emotional collapse. She simply lay on her bench near the east wall and looked at the piano in its circle of amber light, and her fingers moved against the wooden bench slats in the pattern of the Chopin Ballad's opening measures. And the muscle memory was so vivid, so physically present, that her hands ached with the need to play the way a runner's legs ache with the need to run. And she stood up and walked to the piano and sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard and placed her fingers on the keys and played. If you can feel what that first note meant to this woman, if you understand what it means to touch the thing you were made for after months of silence, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that notification bell, because the man who hears this music is about to have his world shattered. The Chopin Ballade No. 1 in G minor begins with a question, a slow, searching, unaccompanied melody in the left hand. 7 notes that rise and fall like a breath, like the beginning of a story whose ending is not yet known. It is one of the most recognizable openings in all of piano literature, and Lena played it the way her mother had taught her to play it, as if she were speaking to someone who was not in the room, but who might be listening from somewhere beyond the walls. The station was empty. The marble floors reflected the amber emergency lighting in long, liquid streaks. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the piano, the Bosendorfer, an instrument built to fill concert halls, an instrument whose resonance and depth of tone are unmatched in the piano world, responded to Lena's touch with the eagerness of a voice that has been silent too long and is finally permitted to speak. She played the entire ballade, 12 minutes of music that begins in questioning melancholy and builds through passages of extraordinary technical difficulty to a coda of shattering intensity. The left hand, driving octaves beneath the right hand's cascading runs, the dynamics swelling from whisper to thunder, the entire architecture of the piece rising to a climax that Chopin himself described as a confession, and that Lena played with the ferocity and the tenderness and the grief of a woman who was confessing everything: the loss of her country, the loss of her mother, the loss of her career, the loss of the life she had been building, note by note since she was 6 years old, and the survival, the stubborn, defiant, music-sustained survival that had carried her across 4 borders and deposited her on this bench in front of this piano, in this empty station in this foreign city where no one knew her name or her talent or the fact that the hands washing dishes in a restaurant kitchen for €8 an hour were the same hands that had won the Lysenko Prize and performed Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto with the Kiev Symphony at the age of 23. She finished. The last chord, a thunderous G minor, reverberated through the grand hall, bouncing off marble and iron and glass, filling the empty space with sound that decayed slowly, reluctantly, as if the station itself did not want the music to end. Lena sat at the bench with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed, and the tears she had been refusing to cry for 4 months ran down her face in the silence that followed the last note. And the silence was different now. It was not the silence of an unplayed piano, but the silence of a piano that has just been played magnificently, a silence that is full rather than empty, that hums with the memory of what just happened. She did not know that Dominic Ferrante was standing 40 feet away in the shadow of the East Colonnade, where he had been standing for the past 12 minutes, motionless, barely breathing, listening to a stranger play his dead mother's piano in his dead mother's station with his dead mother's piece. The Chopin ballade that Katerina had played every Christmas Eve for 40 years, the piece that Dominic associated so completely with his mother that hearing it was like hearing her voice, like being summoned back to the parlor at Palazzo Ferrante, where Katerina would sit at the Bosendorfer in her dark blue dress and play while the family listened and the candles burned and the world outside. The dangerous, compromised, morally ambiguous world that the Ferrante family inhabited was held at bay by the music, kept outside the parlor door by the simple, extraordinary power of a woman playing Chopin. Dominic had been at the station by accident. A late meeting at the port, logistics, the movement of certain containers, the mundane machinery of an empire that functioned on schedules and relationships, and the careful management of risk, had run long, and rather than calling Sal for the car, he had walked through the station as a shortcut to the parking garage on the east side, the way he had walked 1,000 times, past the piano he had donated in his mother's name and that he always acknowledged with a glance and a private nod, the small ritual of a son honoring a mother he missed every day, with the particular ache of a man who had been loved unconditionally by exactly one person in his life, and who understood, now that she was gone, how rare and how irreplaceable that love had been. He had heard the first notes from the west entrance, the Chopin, the unmistakable opening melody, those 7 searching notes. And he had stopped walking. He had stopped breathing. He had stood in the entrance with the night air behind him and the music ahead of him, and his body had refused to move forward or backward, because the sound coming from the grand hall was his mother's piece, played on his mother's piano, and the effect was so immediate, so visceral, so completely devastating that his legs locked and his hands went still, and the strategic mind that ran a criminal empire shut down entirely. And what remained was a 45-year-old man hearing his mother's music and being unable to do anything except listen. He had moved eventually, slowly, carefully, the way a person moves towards something they are afraid will disappear if approached too quickly. He had walked through the grand hall to the east colonnade and stood in the shadow of a marble column and watched a woman he had never seen, slender, auburn-haired, wearing a coat too large for her, play the Bösendorfer with a technique and an emotional depth that he recognized because he had grown up listening to someone who played the same way, with the same commitment, the same refusal to treat the piano as anything less than a living voice. The woman was crying. She was sitting at his mother's piano with her hands in her lap, and her eyes closed, and she was crying. And Dominic Ferrante, a man who had not cried at his mother's funeral, who had stood at the graveside with the dry composure of someone who processes grief as strategy, who converts loss into action, who builds walls rather than shedding tears, felt his own eyes sting and his own throat tighten and his own carefully maintained composure fracture along a fault line he had not known existed. He did not approach her. He stood in the shadow and he watched her cry, and he waited, because approaching a crying woman in an empty train station at midnight is not something a man of his size and his presence can do without causing alarm, and because he did not trust himself to speak, because the words that were forming in his mind were not words he could say to a stranger. The words were for Katerina, for his mother, for the woman who had played this piece every Christmas Eve and who had died 3 years ago of a stroke in the parlor, beside the empty space where the piano had once stood, because Dominic had already moved it to the station by then, had already donated it, had already placed the plaque, had already done the one thing he could think of to honor a mother who believed music belonged to everyone. And Katerina had looked at the empty space and smiled and said, "Good. Now everyone can hear it." And those had been among the last things she said, because the stroke came 2 weeks later, and the parlor was silent, and the piano was in the station, and Katerina was gone. He came back the next night. He told himself it was the shortcut. The meeting had run late again. The parking garage was on the east side. The route through the station was practical. He knew it was a lie. He came back because the music had opened something in him that he could not close. A door to a room where Katerina's memory lived not as the managed, contained grief he had cultivated for 3 years, but as a raw, present, breathing thing that demanded attention. She was there. The same bench, the same coat, the same canvas bag. She was not playing. She was lying on the bench with her head on the bag and her eyes open, staring at the vaulted ceiling, and the piano sat in its circle of light, waiting. He watched from the colonnade. He waited. At 11:40, she sat up. At 11:45, she walked to the piano. At 11:50, she began to play. Not the Chopin this time, but Debussy, the Clair de Lune, which Katerina had also played, which every pianist plays, but which this woman played with a specific quality of tenderness that made the familiar piece sound as if it were being composed in real time, each note discovered rather than performed. He came back every night that week. Wednesday she played Schumann. Thursday she played Liszt. Friday she played Rachmaninoff, the prelude in C-sharp minor, the piece that builds from a tolling, funeral bass to a climax of almost unbearable intensity. And Dominic stood in the shadow of the column and listened, and the music dismantled him, piece by piece, note by note, the way water dismantles stone, slowly, persistently, with the patient authority of something that is stronger than what it is dissolving. On Saturday, he spoke to Father Antonio Grisi. The station chaplain was in his small office near the south entrance, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, and Dominic stood in the doorway. Too large for the small space, too expensive for the humble furniture, and said, "The woman who plays the piano at night, who is she?" Father Antonio looked at Dominic over the rim of his mug with the expression of a man who has known this particular visitor since infancy, and who is not intimidated by suits or reputations or the particular aura of controlled power that Dominic carried the way other men carried briefcases. Her name is Lena. She is a refugee, Ukrainian, I believe, with Armenian heritage. She arrived 4 months ago. She has temporary papers, but no permanent housing. She sleeps in the station because the shelters are full. She washes dishes at Trattoria Lombardi during the day. She is a trained pianist. Conservatory educated, I gather, though she doesn't talk about it much. She is proud and she is frightened, and she is very, very talented, Dominic. And if you are about to tell me to make her stop playing, I will refuse, because that piano was given to this station so that people could play it, and she plays it more beautifully than anyone has since your mother. I'm not going to tell you to make her stop. Father Antonio studied him. The priest had officiated Caterina's funeral. He had watched Dominic stand at the graveside with his jaw locked and his eyes dry, and his body rigid with the effort of containing a grief that had no outlet, because Dominic Ferrante did not permit himself outlets, did not drink to excess, did not rage, did not weep, did not do any of the things that grieving people do to release the pressure of loss. He had worried about Dominic for 3 years. He worried about him now, standing in the doorway, with an expression the priest had never seen on this man's face. Not the controlled neutrality, not the strategic calm, but something open, something vulnerable, something that looked like a man, standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to step forward. She plays Caterina's piece, Dominic said. The Chopin Ballade. She plays it the way my mother played it. I know. I've heard her. I thought of Caterina the first time. How does she know to play it like that? She never heard my mother play. Perhaps the piano remembers. Perhaps the music carries something of everyone who has played it. Perhaps your mother chose well when she told you to put it where everyone could reach it. Perhaps the right hands always find the right instrument. Father Antonio sipped his coffee. Or perhaps it is simply that great musicians playing great music sound similar because they have all arrived at the same truth through different paths. Either explanation is acceptable. I prefer the first because I am a priest, and I am permitted to believe in things that cannot be measured. Dominic did not go to the station that Saturday night. He went to Palazzo Ferrante instead. He went to the parlor, the room he had not entered in 3 years, the room where the unfaded rectangle of parquet marked the Bosendorfer's absence, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the empty space and the sheet music on the stand and his mother's reading glasses on the side table and the cup of tea that the housekeeper still replaced every morning, and he allowed himself, for the first time since Caterina's death, to feel the full weight of what he had lost. His mother had been the only clean thing in his life, the only person in the Ferrante world who existed entirely outside the family business, who refused to know the details, who called the piano the only clean room in a dirty house, and who meant it, who had built, within the walls of a criminal estate, a space of beauty and discipline and art that the violence could not enter because Caterina would not permit it. She had taught Dominic to play when he was 7. He had been competent, technically proficient, rhythmically sound, capable of performing the simpler Chopin nocturnes and the easier Mozart sonatas. But he had not had the gift. His hands were too large, his temperament too controlled, his relationship with the music too intellectual and not sufficiently emotional. Caterina had told him gently when he was 14 that he would not be a pianist, and the gentleness had not masked the truth, that the music required something he could not give it, a surrender of control that was antithetical to who he was becoming, and that the piano would always be a hobby for him, where it was a vocation for her. He had accepted this without resentment. He had listened instead. Every Christmas Eve, every Sunday afternoon when Caterina practiced, every evening when the sound of the Bosendorfer drifted through the estate and found him wherever he was, in the study, in the garden, in the dark rooms where the family business was conducted, the music had reached him and reminded him that there was beauty in the world, and that his mother was its guardian, and that as long as she played, the ugliness he participated in was not the whole story. Now she was gone, and the piano was in a train station, and a refugee was playing it at midnight, and the music was reaching him again, through marble and shadow and 3 years of sealed grief. And Dominic Ferrante stood in his mother's empty parlor and understood that something was happening that he had not planned and could not control, and that frightened him in a way that business rivals and law enforcement and the entire apparatus of threat that defined his world had never frightened him, because this was not a threat to his empire. This was a threat to the walls he had built around the place where his mother's memory lived, and the woman with the auburn hair and the too large coat was dismantling those walls with Chopin the way Katerina had built them. We're deep in this now, a mother's ghost, a refugee's hands, and a man who forgot how to feel until the music reminded him. If this story has you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. Hit that like button and leave a comment, because what happens when Dominic finally speaks to Lena will change both of their lives. He went back on Sunday night. He did not stand in the shadows. He walked through the grand hall to the piano platform, and he sat on the marble step 3 feet from the bench where Lena was playing. Chopin again, the Ballade, his mother's piece, and he listened openly, visibly, without concealment. And when she finished and opened her eyes and saw him sitting there, this large, immaculately dressed man with salt and pepper hair and dark eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who is accustomed to being watched and who has chosen, tonight, to watch instead. She did not startle. She looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had read rooms across 4 countries, and she recognized something. Not danger, not threat, but grief. She recognized grief because she carried her own, and grief has a frequency that other grieving people can detect the way musicians detect a note played slightly flat, instinctively, without analysis, in the body rather than the mind. "That piano belonged to my mother," Dominic said. His voice echoed in the empty station. "She played that piece every Christmas Eve for 40 years. Lena looked at the brass plaque. For Katerina, who believed music belonged to everyone. She looked at the man on the marble step. She looked at the piano beneath her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know it was personal to someone. I thought... The plaque says it belongs to everyone." "It does. My mother wanted that. She said music in a locked room is music wasted." He paused. "She would have loved the way you play." "How do you know how she would have felt?" "Because I grew up listening to her play that exact piece on that exact piano, and the way you play it is the way she played it. Not the technique. The technique is different. Your technique is more aggressive, more physically committed. But the feeling, the emotional architecture, the way the first theme carries grief and the second theme carries hope, and the coda carries both simultaneously. She played it that way. You play it that way. I've heard hundreds of pianists play the Chopin Ballade, and none of them played it the way she did until you." Lena studied this man. His expensive clothes, his controlled voice, his dark eyes that were not controlled at all, that were open and raw and carrying something that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. The look of someone who has lost the person who made the world make sense. "My mother taught me the Ballade," Lena said, "in Kiev. She's a pianist, too. She's still in Lviv. She couldn't leave. She said the music would travel even if she couldn't." "Your mother sounds like mine." "All pianist mothers sound alike. They all believe the music is more important than the musician. They're probably right." Dominic almost smiled. It was the same almost smile. The mechanical near miss, the facial muscles remembering a shape they had not made in 3 years. "Will you play it again? Now? Now, please." Lena looked at this man who was asking her to play his dead mother's piece on his dead mother's piano in an empty train station at midnight, and she understood that what he was asking for was not a performance. It was a séance. He wanted to hear his mother in the music the way she heard her own mother in the music. Across distance, across absence, through the medium of notes and chords, and the particular resonance of a Bösendorfer Imperial that remembered every hand that had ever played it. She played the ballade from the beginning, the questioning opening, the lyrical second theme, the building tension, the technical fireworks, the shattering coda, and Dominic sat on the marble step 3 feet from the piano and closed his eyes and listened, and the music filled the empty station the way light fills a dark room, completely, irresistibly, transforming the space from a transit hub into a cathedral, from a place people pass through into a place where something holy is happening. When she finished, the silence held them both. Neither spoke. Neither moved. The last chord decayed into the vaulted ceiling and the marble floor and the iron columns, and the station absorbed the sound and held it the way the piano holds silence between performances, actively, reverently, with a memory of beauty still vibrating in its structure. "Every night this week," Dominic said, "I've stood in the colonnade listening to you play. I haven't slept properly. I haven't eaten properly. I have stood in a train station like a man who has lost something and found it in the wrong place and doesn't know whether to be grateful or terrified." "Grateful," Lena said. "Choose grateful. Terror is for people who have something to lose. You and I have already lost. What comes after loss is not terrifying. It's just unfamiliar." He looked at her. This refugee, this displaced pianist, this woman who slept on a bench and washed dishes and played Chopin at midnight with the hands of a concert artist and the resilience of someone who had crossed 4 borders with nothing but music and a gold pendant and the stubborn refusal to stop being who she was. And he felt the walls around Katerina's memory not crumble, but open, like a door, like the fallboard of a piano lifting to reveal the keys beneath. And what was behind the walls was not just grief, but the capacity for something he had sealed away with the grief, the ability to be moved, to be reached, to be changed by another person's presence. "You need a piano," he said. "I have a piano. It's right here. You need a piano that isn't in a train station. You need a place to practice. You're sleeping on a bench, Lena. You're a conservatory-trained pianist sleeping on a bench in a train station. I'm a refugee sleeping on a bench in a train station. The conservatory training is irrelevant to the bench." "It's not irrelevant to me." She looked at him carefully. She had learned, in 4 months of displacement, to read offers the way she read music, looking for the hidden notes, the unwritten dynamics, the subtext beneath the surface. Men had offered her things before. The offers had always contained conditions. The conditions had always been unacceptable. She had learned to refuse with the same precision she brought to her playing. Cleanly, definitively, without ambiguity. "I don't need a patron," she said. "I'm not a charity case, and I'm not a project, and I'm not a replacement for your mother. I am a woman who plays piano because it is the only thing I have left, and I play it here because this piano is available, and this station is where I sleep, and the two facts are related only by geography. I'm not offering charity. I don't know what I'm offering. I'm a man who hasn't felt anything in 3 years sitting on a marble step in a train station at midnight because a stranger played my mother's music, and I felt something. I don't know what to do with that. I run an organization that controls half the port traffic in this city, and I am sitting on a floor because I don't know what to do with what your music made me feel. That is not a position of power. That is not patronage. That is a man asking for help." Lena was quiet for a long time. The station hummed around them. The distant sound of a late freight train, the hiss of heating vents, the particular ambient noise of a large public space at night. She looked at the piano. She looked at the plaque. She looked at the man on the marble step who had just said the most honest thing she had heard since leaving Kiev. "Come back tomorrow night," she said. "I'll play the Schumann. Your mother would have liked the Schumann." "How do you know what my mother would have liked?" "Because I know what my mother likes. And you said our mothers sound alike. So I'll play the Schumann and take Kinderseinen, the scenes from childhood, and you can sit on your step and listen, and we can figure out what this is without either of us pretending to know." He came back the next night. She played the Schumann, Kinderseinen, 13 short pieces that Schumann composed as portraits of childhood, each one a miniature world of innocence and wonder, and the particular tenderness that adults feel when they remember being young. Lena played them with the delicacy they demanded and the depth they concealed, because the Kindersinnen are not simple. They are sophisticated compositions disguised as simplicity, the way a great children's book is not simple, but is instead a complex truth expressed in accessible language. Dominic sat on his marble step and listened, and the seventh piece, Tremorai, the Dreaming, undid him completely, because Katerina had played Tremorai as a lullaby when he was small, her fingers moving over the keys in the dim bedroom, while he fell asleep in the four-poster bed in Palazzo Ferrante, and the sound of Lena playing it in the train station was so precisely the sound of his childhood, of safety, of the time before the family business became his responsibility, and the world became a place that required constant management, that he pressed his hand against his mouth and breathed through his fingers the way he had breathed through his fingers 3 weeks ago when he heard the Chopin for the first time, and the grief and the gratitude were so tangled together that he could not tell where one ended and the other began. The night after that, she played Liszt. The Consolations, 6 pieces written as musical comfort for someone in mourning. She had chosen them deliberately, she told him afterward, because Liszt understood that music is medicine and these pieces are prescriptions. Each one treats a different symptom of loss. Dominic had not known that about Liszt. He had not known anything about classical music beyond what Katerina had taught him, by proximity, by osmosis, by the simple act of playing in the same house for 40 years. Lena was teaching him now, not formally, not didactically, but the way musicians teach civilians, by providing context, by naming the emotions the music carries, by translating the language of notes and chords into the language of human experience. This one, she said before playing the third consolation, is about the moment when grief stops being sharp and becomes soft, when you stop cutting yourself on the memory and start being held by it instead. Your mother would have known that moment. Every pianist knows it. It's in the transition from the minor key to the major, the way the melody rises from darkness into light without abandoning the darkness entirely, because real consolation doesn't erase the pain. It just teaches you to carry it differently. She played. Dominic listened. The station held them both in its marble and iron embrace, and the music filled the space, the way water fills a vessel, completely, finding every corner, leaving nothing untouched. And every night for 3 weeks after that, Dominic Ferrante, a man whose evenings were supposed to be spent in offices and restaurants and the private rooms where the family business was conducted, sat on a marble step in a train station and listened to a refugee play his mother's piano, and the music built between them a structure that was neither friendship nor romance, but something else, something that had no name, something constructed from Chopin and Schumann and Debussy, and the shared understanding that grief is not a wall, but a door, and that the door opens when the right music finds the right silence. On the 4th week, he brought her coffee, not from a machine, from the cafe on Via Roma, the one that Katerina had loved, the one that made the espresso with the crema that Katerina had called the only acceptable coffee in a city of barbarians. He placed the cup on the piano's edge and said, "From Via Roma, my mother's cafe." Lena tasted the coffee. She closed her eyes. "Your mother had good taste. In everything except husbands. My father was a terrible man and an excellent provider, and she loved him anyway, because love is not a rational enterprise, and my mother understood that." Lena laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 4 months. A real laugh, surprised out of her by the deadpan delivery and the affection underneath it. And the sound echoed in the grand hall the way her music echoed, bouncing off marble and glass, filling the empty space with warmth. Father Antonio, who had been watching from his office doorway, crossed himself and muttered, "Finally," and went back to his coffee. The coffee became a ritual. Every night, espresso from Via Roma, placed on the piano's edge, then music, then conversation. Quiet, careful, 2 people learning each other's outlines in the half-dark of a train station after midnight. She told him about Kiev, about the conservatory, about her mother in Lviv, about the war and the journey and the dishes she washed at Trattoria Lombardi with hands that had performed Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto. He told her about Katerina, about the Christmas Eve recitals, about the empty parlor and the replaced tea and the reading glasses on the side table, about the particular loneliness of a powerful man who has no one left, who loves him for reasons unrelated to his power. He did not tell her about the business. She did not ask. They existed in the train station, in a space that Katerina would have recognized and approved of. The clean room, the music room, the place where the piano's voice was the only authority and the only currency and the only thing that mattered. On a Tuesday in March, 4 weeks after the first Chopin ballade, 4 weeks of nightly visits, coffee, music, conversation, Dominic arrived at the station to find Lena not at the piano but on her bench, curled under her too large coat, shivering. The heating system had failed. The station was cold, the marble floors amplifying the chill, the vaulted ceiling holding the cold air like a cathedral holds incense. She was shaking. He took off his overcoat, cashmere, charcoal, worth more than she earned in 2 months of dishwashing, and draped it over her. She looked up at him with eyes that were not crying, but that carried the exhaustion of a woman who had been cold and displaced and proud for 4 months, and whose pride was wearing thin in the February chill. "This can't continue," he said. "You sleeping here. This isn't... You deserve more than a bench." "Deserving has nothing to do with anything. I have what I have." "You have a train station bench and a piano and a gold pendant and a coat that doesn't fit you. Let me help. Not as a patron, not as a project, as the son of a woman who believed music belonged to everyone and who would haunt me, literally, physically haunt me, if she knew I let a pianist of your caliber sleep on a bench within sight of her piano." Lena sat up. She pulled his overcoat around her shoulders. She looked at this man. This dangerous, gentle, grief-carved man who brought her coffee from his dead mother's cafe and sat on a marble floor to listen to her play, and who was now standing in a freezing train station offering her his coat with the expression of someone who was not offering charity, but asking permission to care. "There's a flat," he said, "above a music shop on Via dei Conservatori. It's small. It has a piano, an upright, not a Bosendorfer, but it's tuned and it works. The shop owner owes me, not in a way that involves violence, in a way that involves a business loan I extended at reasonable terms. The flat is empty. You could live there. You could practice. You could play. And what would you want in return? I want you to keep playing at the station. Every night. My mother's piano should be played every night. That's not a condition. You can take the flat whether you play here or not. But I'm asking." Lena looked at the piano in its circle of amber light. She thought about her mother in Lviv, who had pressed the treble clef pendant into her palm and said, "You carry the music where it needs to go." She thought about Katerina, whom she had never met, but whom she knew through the piano and the plaque, and the son who sat on marble steps and listened with the concentration of a man hearing his mother's voice. "I'll take the flat," she said, "and I'll play. Not because you asked, because the piano asked. Because your mother's piano deserves to be played every night, and I am a pianist, and that is what I do." She moved into the flat above the music shop on Via dei Conservatori on a Thursday morning, carrying the canvas bag and the too large coat and nothing else. The shop owner, a thin, quiet man named Gianluca, who repaired instruments and sold sheet music, and who owed Dominic a favor that involved a business loan and not, as Lena had feared, anything darker, met her at the door with a set of keys and a shy smile and the words, "The piano is tuned. I tune it every month. If you need it tuned more often, just ask." The flat was small, a bedroom, a kitchen, a living room with the upright piano against the wall and a window overlooking the street. It was warm. It had running water and a stove and a bed with clean sheets and the particular dignity of a space that belonged to her. The first space that had belonged to her since Kiev, and she stood in the center of the living room on her first evening and pressed her hands against the piano's keys and played a single chord, and the sound filled the flat with the resonance of home. She continued playing at the station. Every night, 11 o'clock, the Busendorfer. Dominic continued coming. The espresso from Via Roma. The marble step, the music, the conversation, the slow, careful, Chopin-scored construction of something that neither of them named because naming it would require acknowledging that a mafia boss and a refugee pianist sitting in a train station at midnight listening to his dead mother's music was either the most improbable love story in the city or the most inevitable one, and both possibilities were equally terrifying and equally true. Father Antonio watched from his office doorway, the chipped mug in his hand, the wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the amber light. He had seen many things in 40 years of ministry at the station. Arrivals and departures, reunions and farewells, the ordinary miracles and catastrophes of human transit. But he had never seen what he was seeing now, a man who had forgotten how to feel learning to feel again, taught by a woman who had lost everything except the one ability that mattered, in a space consecrated not by holy water, but by music and by the memory of a woman named Caterina, who had understood before anyone else that a piano in a public place is not a decoration, but a doorway. He had married couples and buried the dead and baptized the newborn for 40 years, and he knew love when he saw it. Not the dramatic, cinematic love of films and novels, but the real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that builds itself from coffee cups and Chopin, and the shared understanding that both people at the piano have been broken by loss and are being repaired by music and by each other's presence, and by the stubborn, irrational, deeply human refusal to accept that grief is the end of the story. On a night in April, 2 months after the first ballade, Lena finished playing, and Dominic was sitting on the marble step with his eyes closed and his hands still and his face, for the first time since she had known him, unguarded, the controlled neutrality gone, the strategic composure dissolved, the man beneath the boss visible and vulnerable and present. She stood from the bench. She walked to where he sat. She knelt on the marble floor beside him and took his hands, his large, careful, signet-ringed hands, and held them the way a pianist holds an instrument, with attention, with respect, with the understanding that what she was touching was capable of creating something beautiful if handled correctly. "Your mother was right," she said. "Music belongs to everyone, but this music, the music between us, the music we've been building for 2 months in this station, this music belongs to us." Dominic opened his eyes. He looked at her. He looked at the piano. He looked at the plaque for Caterina, who believed music belonged to everyone. And he felt Caterina's presence, not as grief, but as permission, not as loss, but as legacy. The understanding that his mother had put the piano in the station, not just so that strangers could play it, but so that the music could do what music does. Connect people, heal people, build bridges across the distances that loss creates, and bring into the silent spaces where grief lives the sound of something that is stronger than silence and more durable than pain. He leaned forward and kissed her. In the grand hall, beside the piano, on the marble floor of a train station at midnight, a kiss that tasted like espresso from Via Roma and that carried the resonance of every note she had played on his mother's piano. And every night he had sat on the marble step, and every conversation they had built from coffee and Chopin, and the slow, careful, music-sustained act of two broken people finding in each other not a cure, but a harmony. Two voices that had been playing solo and that discovered, in the acoustics of a train station at midnight, that they were parts of the same piece. Thank you for staying with Lena and Dominic through every note of this story. Thank you for believing that music can cross borders and bridge grief and build something beautiful from loss. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who plays, who listens, who knows that the right music at the right moment can change everything. Drop a comment telling me what piece of music carries the most meaning in your life. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the silence inside a piano is not empty. It's waiting. It's always waiting for the right hands to come along and fill it with sound.